Welcome, sports fans, to GenX Classic Sports, where we bring the nostalgia of our sports-filled youth into the present day. Grab your favorite retro jersey, crack open a cold one, and let's stroll down memory lane together. We're here to discuss iconic sports moments, teams, and athletes from our generation. This is GenX Classic Sports, sports talk for Gen Xers by Gen Xers.
Hello, everybody. This is Shon. I just wanted to do a better job at introducing my buddy Wayne before the podcast actually starts. Most of you listen to this. You know Wayne Pumphrey. He's the father of the Dragon Sports Network, the DSN as we refer to it, where we both grew up. And he's kind of, in my opinion, a pioneer in high school sports broadcasting in the state of Arkansas. He's been doing it for longer than anybody else, and he kind of set the standard for that in a really small town at a small high school. So he's also a historian, and he really digs into the history of the area in which we grew up, and sports being a big part of that. He certainly focuses on that. So that's Wayne, and he was in episode 2. And if you want to hear more from him, check out episode 2. But welcome to the podcast. I appreciate you listening. And let's talk about the dual state tournament. Later, everybody who's listened enough, they know who you are, but I'm going to reintroduce you later. We're not going to spend time doing that now, but you and I have spent a lot of time over the years talking about something called the dual state basketball tournament. And you and I grew up in the town where that is hosted in Junction City, Arkansas / Louisiana. And I believe I've heard you refer to it before as at one time the longest running high school basketball tournament west of the Mississippi. Is that correct? Or something to that, something like that?
For a while, it was called, some people, and I say some people, the people I'm referring to is people that keep up with it, researchers, people like that. I, during the 75th anniversary, started looking. And then when the DSN got involved, the 75th anniversary, for those wondering, I believe, was around 2006, 2007. But I went back and got to looking after I talked to you. When the DSN started covering
Mm-hmm.
it, we were still in the old gym. And we would cover usually, I think, the last 2 nights of it. And we were wondering how old it was, where it ranked, and all that. So after that dual state was over, which I believe was 2016, I went to looking. And I will call it this, Sean, and I'll stand by it. At one point, the dual state tournament was the oldest continuous boys and girls tournament in the nation. There were tournaments, and I'll admit, that started sooner than dual state. But it would be a boys tournament. I didn't find a girls tournament like that. I did find boys tournaments. The girls tournaments I did come across were not
Yeah.
near as old as dual state. So I'll stand by the continuous boys and
Okay.
girls
Well, and that's
tournament.
impressive enough as it is. And did it run 89 years before it stopped? Is that correct, or did I miss it by a few years?
I believe
Okay,
you're right,
89
as
years.
89. What gets a little confusing is that, as you know, the last week of January, we all look forward to it because that was dual state. And the year they switched to we're going to do it in December. They did 2 tournaments that year, one in January and one in December. And for some reason, it got everybody confused. But I had it
Yeah.
as you did at 89.
You know what's interesting? I think you're right. I think there's a lot of tournaments nowadays that are just male or just female, but you don't see a lot of co-mingled tournaments with the boys teams and the girls teams playing in the same location. That's probably a logistical thing, and if you really think about it, it's amazing that the school pulled that off with one gym for as long as they did. Really.
Yeah, you're right. One of the draws for a coach for dual state was the fact that for a while, especially when we were growing up, a coach sometimes would be coaching both teams, boys and girls, varsity. Now you'd have different coaches, junior varsities, but hey, I'm going to get in a tournament, and I need my girls to play, need the boys to play. Dual state offered that, so you would have a coach, and the school was good about back in the day working with them. Hey, we'll have your boys game and then he'd get a break, and then the girls' game or vice versa. There would be a game in between. And he would be, the coach would be able to relax a little bit, and then get ready instead of just running out there. And or some coaches say, "Hey, go ahead and if you can put them back, it's fine with me." And that was one
Well,
of
the
the draws
smaller
for
the
coaches.
school, the more likely the same coach coached both teams. I mean, that's just the way it was.
Yeah, and it really benefited school, having that, because
Yeah,
now you got
right,
two teams
right.
coming, not one. You
And I
got
guess
two.
we should back up a minute because there's going to be a person or two, as David says, among our ones of listeners. There's going to be a person or two who may not be familiar with it. And let me just say that the whole point of the tournament to me was always that you had teams from two different states playing against each other. That's why it was called the dual state, is my understanding. And we're talking about North Louisiana and South Arkansas teams crossing or meeting, technically meeting at the state line and playing against each other against teams they wouldn't normally schedule. And what's fascinating about it is that going back as far as it does, people didn't get so caught up in all the classifications and whatnot because there really weren't many early on. It was just an open format, probably. Later on, as you had Arkansas schools, it became B size schools for a while. Arkansas, I know, had B and A and double A and on up. And Louisiana even had C size schools and B size schools. And then we're all now kind of used to the A, double A, triple A thing because it's kind of standardized more now. But the whole point of this was that no, you didn't necessarily get what I would call a current 7A school necessarily down there playing, but you had dozens of schools that were within a few students of each other enrollment wise, from C and B in Louisiana up to single A and double A in Arkansas. There was not a huge discrepancy in enrollment, I would think. And the whole appeal was that these small schools were so geographically close to each other, even if they were across the state line. And I think you and I were joking yesterday that most likely a 70, we don't know, we're throwing a number out there, but 75% of the participants probably bust in within an hour of the town. They probably were not many teams
Yes.
farther than an hour away. So we're talking dozens of schools. If I'm right, Wayne, didn't they have a bracket of 64 teams one year? Was that boys only or girls or both? Wasn't 64 the number one year in one of the brackets or something? Or am I making that up?
I know. I've got to go back and look. I know for a fact they had 52 teams one year, which Sean, that's unheard of. I mean, that's think about this, and you can tell folks about the gym a little more in depth, but for those listening, think of a bandbox
Right,
Hoosiers type
right.
gym, and you got 52 teams roll in, and I believe this was in the early 70s. I want to say, Sean, 71, 72, somewhere in that neighborhood. 52 teams roll in. And I remember interviewing Mr. Muse years later, Paul H. Muse, who was involved with school district for 36 years, coached, helped build the football field, coached football too. The field we're at now, that's why it's named after him. He told me they pulled it off without a hitch. The schedule was set up. They brought them in, brought them out, and you did it all in 1 week. In
Yeah.
6 days and nights, they played the whole tournament, 52 teams. Now, there was some more that got up in the high 40s. There may have
I,
been one bigger than the 52. I'll have to go back and look. But I remember that because he was proud of the fact that the administration then got together, got it ready, and
yeah, and
pulled it
what
off
people
without a
that are
hitch.
younger and maybe not from Arkansas and Louisiana need to understand about that is that prior to some point in the 80s there were no rules or laws against playing games any time of day. So it was the Governor Bill Clinton administration, I believe, that said you can't play athletics until whatever 3 p.m. or something, whatever 3:30.
3:30. That was that was in 1983. His wife
Yep.
helped orchestrate that. Uh, I believe I was trying to think of the name of it. It had the word blue in it. Why I remember that, I don't know. But that did kind of hurt stuff. But what Dual State did was at 3:30 on the dot, you started hooping, and then they backed up to starting on a Saturday and running to Saturday off Sunday, of course.
Explain more now that I'm thinking about it, how foreign this might be to people. We're talking about a tournament with, say, 36, 48, whatever teams in it, boys and girls. And we're talking about playing it all in one bandbox gym that probably half the high schools in America had. They were all kind of the same design, just like you see in the Hoosiers movie. But they started the games at 9:30 or 10 o'clock in the morning. And that was how they were getting away with playing. I say 9:30 or 10. It may have been 11, but it was early. I mean, they played morning game. And so Wayne and I grew up in a school district hosting this event, and we could pay our dime or quarter or whatever it was, and the whole class would go to the games after lunch or whatever. You go to lunch and then go to the games and then go get the bus and go home.
Yeah, they would bring. I remember being in elementary way back in the day, and we all knew. I don't care how old you were, you knew Dual
Yep.
State was coming. And the day that we would go, usually it would be at the start of the tournament. They would bring the whole elementary. You paid to get in, and then you'd have $2 or $3 on you. And the older students, as we called them, would come up in the stands and say, "You cannot think about this. You talk about the way things are now. Here's a health issue for some folks. They're selling candy to kids after. I mean, we're loading up on it.
Yes.
Man, we had a blast, and it was fun to watch. And
Go
let me
ahead.
say this now before I forget, Sean. We're not just talking about, okay, this is a tournament they played basketball. This was a quality tournament that you saw quality play and coaching. Hall of Fame coaches in the Arkansas and Louisiana sports Hall of Fames coached in this tournament. And I know, pretty sure later you want to get into players. The players that come through here, I
Yeah.
mean, they're
NBA
legendary.
players.
Yes, sir. Played in this tournament, and don't get distracted by the fact that we're talking about small schools like you mentioned, but these teams were competitive. And I remember, and I believe it was Coach Gary Don Smith of Union who made the statement. I'm not going to swear to it. I believe it was him. The reason he wanted in dual state, well, for one, it's close by quality play, but he said playing in dual state is like playing in the state tournament. And if you can win it or handle playing in it, then you'll be ready for state. That's how good the
Correct. And,
basketball was.
not only that, but the thing that I think needs to be mentioned that you and I talked about yesterday before I forget it is that for anybody listening who's not familiar with it and thinks, oh, it's just a bunch of tiny little schools. No, the advantage to the tiny little school thing is that you didn't have a football team and you thought about basketball year round practically. Yeah, you probably played baseball, ran track maybe. But those schools, they hit the gym in the summer. They stayed in the gym in the summer. They didn't have football get between them and the basketball season. Schools like ours that was a little bigger and played football, those were mostly the same guys. You had a few that didn't play football, but for the most part, you had to wait until football season was over and immediately roll into basketball. Well, these other schools that were smaller, like the one Karl Malone went to, for example, they didn't have to deal with that. So they were playing a month earlier than you whenever the state allowed them to. They were already playing. And so back in the day, I'm not really sure there were too many limits on how many games because sometimes you'd see in the newspaper that a
Oh, no.
Louisiana team had won state and they'd be like 42-2 or something. They play because of tournaments.
Yep.
I don't think there were limits on how many tournaments except your budget. And that was another thing. These teams could come play in this tournament and they didn't need to stay in hotels. It was an easy drive for them. It was an
Yep.
easy drive for the fans, except for the few times that it snowed and caused a lot of chaos for the dual state tournament, from what I understand. But, um, you know, it was not a bad thing that you had all these small schools. In fact, it made the basketball even better. So that's something I think is important to point out as well. So yes, as Wayne was saying, Hall of Fame level coaches, Hall of Fame at every level players, and then the coaches who came in to
Yep.
recruit. Dale Brown, I remember they made a big deal out of Dale Brown, from who's LSU's legendary basketball coach, being in the stands. I am quite sure Leon Barmore, who and Sanja Hogue, or whatever her name was, from Louisiana Tech, Lady Texters program, quite sure they made the trip up there over the years, and just on and on and on about all the different college coaches that, at least in person, came in and sat down. And Wayne, do you have any understanding at all of how many seats we could, how many people we could hold in the old gym? By the way, folks, this is going to be confusing. People from my hometown refer to the old gym and the old gym and the new. It gets really confusing. We're on our third gym that hosted this tournament. This tournament
Yeah,
went across three gyms, and depending on what generation you were, the old gym may refer to two different buildings. So Wayne and I, as students,
right.
experienced it in what we called the new gym, which
In
was
the
built
new
in the
gym.
50s.
Yeah, 1953, 54 it opened. Or it was built and opened in 54. That's the one we refer to, you and I, as the new gym. The old
Right. And
gym
it
was in that
hosted
old red
games.
building, and one side was stands and the other side was a stage for plays and events like that. And now, of course, we're in Dragon Arena, which is the third one. But
So that's across
it
our
hosted a
three
few.
gyms that
Yep.
we're referring to. So if it gets confusing, it probably is to us as
Yep.
well. But Wayne, you have any idea of what we used to call the new gym built in 53? How many people that thing held at any point? I mean, do you have any, has anyone ever mentioned that?
The number I heard, of course, this was the night Bobby Joe Douglas and Marion rolled in, and he was
Mm-hmm.
leading the nation in scoring. That night, they had close to 3,000 people in there. Now, that's the stands packed out, set in Indian style, where, we always had the issue with people walking because it was so small. They were sitting Indian style around the court, and the foyer was packed. And I heard anywhere from 2,800 to 3,000 in there. Now that's of course packed out. I think you could conservatively say about 2,500 would be safe as the average. Not just you can't move, because that night it was packed out. So the gym, and let me say this, Sean. I was just talking to folks earlier. That gym was worth every penny spent on it. And it wasn't a lot spent on it if you hear the story of how it got built. And that's a subject for another time. But to serve 62 years,
Yeah.
62 dual states, they got their money's worth.
If you can picture
And then some.
bleachers that aren't individual seats, they're just bench style. And if you can picture, they're completely wrapped around the arena, and the bottom row was also the bench for the players, so there was no just chairs. You're talking 3 feet at, no, I wouldn't even say that, a foot and a half of space between the edges of the court and the front row. And if people were sitting on the floor Indian style, there was no room. The referees would have to move them out of the way to take the
Oh,
ball in if it went out over there. You can't imagine how close to the action the fans were. Nowadays, these arenas are all pit style, I call it, where they're dug out, they sink into the ground. You're above all the action. Imagine sitting at the actual ground level with all these great teams playing, and the front row being the same. They're literally feet planted on the same parquet floor that or hardwood floor that the players are using. So it's a lot of people in a small area. And I've always joked that I don't know who came up with the idea of putting the bathroom lines and the concession stand lines and the lines to get into the door all in the same room, but they did. And so you had utter chaos in that lobby area,
oh
because you
God.
walked in, there was a line there taking up money, which ran into the line coming out of the bathrooms, which ran into the lines to the concession stand all at once.
And
And
the
the pop
popcorn machine
it
was
was the
against the wall
smallest
there.
lobby you can imagine for those kind of, and granted, those were the crowds you had once a year, but um that number is alarmingly high because of fire code reasons. Now that you say 2,000 plus people is kind of scary.
Oh,
And the bleachers were tall. It was a pretty good ways up there. And if you think on a 20-degree night it'd be impossible to have a gym run that hot, you're crazy, because that many people packed in there. It was a steamy, hot. It was Man, you'd have to get up. You'd have to get up at the top where the windows would open to breathe. Let that 20-degree air in there if it was that cold. But I hope we've set the scene. Kind of, there's a style of those gyms that I've heard about, and I don't know if ours was exactly that style, but they went all around the country in the 40s and 50s, kind of making the same gym at just about every school. So it fit that style for sure that you've probably seen in movies and such. And of course, people from our hometown, they're definitely used to it. But it's definitely a throwback old gym. But so these teams all would come in, boys and girls teams, and they'd mix it up with schools from across the state line. And then, as the bracket wore on, they might play someone in their district. You just never knew. But Wayne said it right. It was a good preparation. It was a month. Yeah, it was a month before the postseason for everybody. Yeah,
Yeah, about a month.
yeah,
Actually, a
yeah.
little less when you consider you had district tournaments probably 2 weeks out, maybe two and a half, and then your regionals right behind it. So yeah,
Yeah, and I hate to say this because somebody's going to get mad, but I used to hear that one of one of Junction's basketball team's kind of mental hurdles was always that we put so much emphasis, man, on hosting that thing and trying to do well in it that they put everything they had into that. And some years are just with good teams, there wasn't a whole lot left for the district and regional tournaments if we got there because we expended so much energy, a lot of years trying to win the dual state tournament, and there may be some truth to that.
I can think of two coaches off the top of my head that told me we might as well stop playing basketball after dual. Once dual state was
Right.
through, let's go on and play baseball because the emphasis, and it was a very strong emphasis. We want to win this tournament.
Just think that's a result of hosting such a big event, and you want to do well. Generations of families played in this thing. I did not play in it. I was hurt when I was on the basketball team and the first year and didn't get to play in it, and then I didn't play anymore. My brother played in it and won it. My uncle, my dad. You've got family probably that played in it. Everybody's got family that played in it. And it was almost a family event. I can remember those there were Saturday afternoon sessions. The semis were on Saturday afternoons. And if you won, of course, you played in the finals that night. And I can remember those Saturday afternoon sessions. You'd see people coming in from out of town, man. They might have married and moved away and they got a nephew playing in dual state on a Saturday. They're coming to town for that. So it was quite the event. And Wayne, you graduated in 82 and I was 89. What
82.
year was it where they sold the 50th anniversary t-shirts? Do you remember that? There was a purple t-shirt with a gold logo on it that was for 50 years, I believe. Was that right? For
Gold
50?
logo and
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
gold
But do you
program.
81. Okay. I thought they were
1981.
yeah.
81.
So
81. Because at one point, Sean, and I just, again, in fact, I was talking to some of your kinfolk. I made the statement, and everybody in the room agreed wholeheartedly. There was a period from 1978 79 through probably 1982, maybe 83, that some of the best basketball in this country was played in that gym here in Junction City in the dual
yeah.
state tournament. I mean, that was how competitive it was.
Is there anything about the history and the background on it you want to mention? And I want to say now, Wayne is working on other projects similar to this that I'll probably participate in later on. Whether it's podcasts or videos or interviews or written documents or whatever. So there's some history stuff that Wayne is putting a lot of work into about dual state. And you can imagine with an 89-year event, it's a lot of history. So Wayne's working real hard on some stuff too that we're going to later talk about. So there's other opportunities to really dig into the history. For our purposes, I brought this up as a topic because this is a show about Gen X, and the first person I ever saw dunk a basketball in a game in person was Karl Malone.
And okay, that's your first one in that time frame I'm talking about. Karl Malone, one of the 50 greatest players in NBA history, when they announced that back in the mid 90s, I believe, or latter 90s.
and I've got a list of his stuff to talk about later. But he's the first human being I saw dunk a basketball in person, and it made such an impression on me clearly. And then to think that, I followed his career all the way through 2004. After whenever that happened, I'm going to assume, looking at his dates that he played, that was around 80 or 81 ish when that happened with him. And maybe 83, 82. It doesn't matter. I was 10, 11, 12 years old over there during school time. It was a afternoon session, and it sounded like he tore that into the gym apart when he dunked it. And so I got to thinking, wow, Gen X has a representative big time that traces right back to my hometown. And, we joke on this podcast that all roads lead through Arkansas. There's so many events in the world of sports. There's an Arkansan involved. It's unbelievable. Whether it's Super Bowls, World Series, it's crazy. NBA Finals, Scottie Pippen, the dynasty of the Bulls, Scottie Pippen. You've got all these things that kind of the people involved somehow or another flowed through Arkansas. And this is another one because this was South Arkansas where the gym actually sat, even though the town is on both sides. And so I saw Karl dunk that basketball, but I also saw there were two other cats that played in that thing that we're going to talk about eventually. One of them we're going to talk about was a guy named Benny Anders, and he got re-famous all over again within the last, I don't know, since COVID maybe, because there was a documentary
Yep.
came out on ESPN 30 for 30, and I don't know if it actually came out since COVID or if it hit Netflix or something and a whole new audience saw it for the first time, but it's a 30 for 30 on Phi Slamma Jamma out of the University of Houston. And one of the participants, one of the players on that team was Benny Anders. And Benny Anders was from a small town called Bernice, Louisiana, which participated in dual state against, here's the crazy part, overlapping with Mr. Karl Malone and his team out of a small town called Summerfield, Louisiana. And they were both there in that early 80s time. And then I'm going to throw this out there because this is a third guy that Wayne and I talked about yesterday, and we both know that he has his own special story, and that was a dude named Bobby Joe Douglas. And we're not going to cover all three today. There's not enough time, but I promise Wayne, I'm very anxiously looking forward to his projects on Bobby Joe because he's got stuff going where he's going to spend some time talking about Bobby Joe, and I'm going to call the podcast that I cover him The Legend of Bobby Joe Douglas, honestly, because that's the appropriate title.
Yeah, that would be the perfect title.
Those three guys were three of the best basketball players in America, and they overlapped somewhat at this dual state tournament. So imagine a kid sitting there. You're just kind of hearing that. I know my parents talked about, hey, that Douglas guy is going to play this week at dual state. And I'm thinking, what's the deal with this guy? And then you'd hear about Benny Anders. My dad worked in Bernice for 30 years or whatever. And he would talk about Benny Anders. And then of course I go over there and I see Karl Malone, and he's played on a team with his brother at one point, I believe. Was it Terry Malone? Is that right?
Terry, Terry, who's a very good player himself.
These were three. I should say Bobby Joe Douglas played in a little town called Marion, Louisiana. We should say that these are three small high schools. And there's even more irony to the situation, I guess, if you will. Someone from our hometown ended up being Bobby Joe's high school basketball coach. And there's a lot of connections between our hometown and that coach and that city, Marion. A lot of connections with Junction. Just things in my family are connected to that. There's a lot of weird stuff going on here. So we're going to do a legend of Bobby Joe Douglas, who's the third, and his name will come back up as we talk about these other two. But let's transition into Benny Anders and Karl. I don't know how we can talk about them so much individually as far as dual state. Wayne, what do you remember date-wise and so forth about them playing against each other or sort of their roles on their teams and so forth leading into some of these dual states back in the early 80s?
Well, first, let me say this. We interviewed Bobby Joe Douglas' coach this past Sunday, Malcolm George. And Malcolm made a statement that I think your listeners will really appreciate and understand, especially when it ties in to what you're doing. And that is these teams would see each other anywhere from 4 to 6 times in a season. So you had a
North
rivalry
Louisiana
just with that
teams. I wanted to
alone.
straighten that out. They're all
But
North Louisiana teams. Go ahead.
yes, I mean, all of them. Okay, now you got Bernice. It's
Yep.
14 miles south of here. If you go 11 miles east, when you get to Bernice, you run into Summerfield. If you get to Bernice and you go about 28 miles,
West.
or I say east, I should say west of
Right.
Summerfield, east to Marion,
Yep.
they're all close together. At this same time, don't forget Spearsville, Louisiana. They had very good teams. So you had a lot of competitive basketball, but the two that stood out in 1981, you was asking what year that I remember real well was Benny Anders and Karl Malone, and that dual state. It came down to them. Benny, of course, as you said, went on to play at the University of Houston, five slamma jamma. Folks go back and watch that will find out that he was probably the best player on the team. And you go, okay, well, now we're talking about Akeem Olajuwon, Clyde Drexler, Larry Mishaw, Michael Young. They had some
Yes, they
quality
did.
players. And the one they all talked about that stood out was Benny. And if folks want to know more about him,
Yeah.
go on YouTube, watch the 1983 Final Four, the last 30 seconds. And right before the famous shot, and then Lorenzo Charles dunks it, North Carolina State Wolfpack, another 30 for 30, by
Yeah.
the way, survive and advance. You're going to see a pass, and a Houston Cougar almost steals it. I mean, Sean
Yeah.
is fingertips away from getting it.
Yep.
That was Benny Anders. And everybody thought he had the ball. If he'd have had it, it'd been a
He was
dunk to end the
he
game
was
anyway.
freakishly
That would have wrapped it
athletic, is
up.
what I keep hearing about.
Oh Lord, yes. Well, his cousin was Orlando Woolridge, who played in the NBA, who old school. They around
Yeah.
the same time as Julius Erving and others. When Curtis Blow was rapping about basketball, Orlando Woolridge, if I can say it right, stood out. He was also kin to a guy by the name of Willis Reed. Yeah, and Willis Reed was from Hyco. If you go about, well, Sean, how far would you say?
Sure.
About 7 more miles
Yeah.
south of Bernice, you run into Hyco right
Yeah.
before you get to Dubach,
Yeah.
Louisiana. So that 81 dual state, Bobby Joe Doug's already graduated. But the 81 was exciting because you had these two guys coming in. And everybody talked about, well, the outlaw.
Correct.
That was Benny
Correct.
Anders' nickname, the outlaw. Karl commanded the attention because, well, you look at Karl Malone, you go, okay, this guy can definitely take over a ball game easy, and he could, and he did. But everyone, where's he going to end up at? And of course, he ends up going to Louisiana Tech, which is another story in itself for another time. Benny went on, of course, to the University of Houston, who I think Benny played in '82 dual state. I'm almost certain he did. Uh, went to the Final Four, and that was the famous Michael Jordan Final Four, where he had shot at the end near the end of the game to beat Georgetown. So Benny comes on. They've been to the Final Four, and he helps lead them to
Yeah.
two more.
Benny is anything you read about Benny or watch documentaries or whatever, you hear that he was a freakish athlete. Like, I think he was about a 6'5" to 6'6" guy. So in college, that's going to make you a small
Yep.
forward or a shooting guard, and could jump out of the gym. I mean, I know I saw him play in dual state. He didn't make the impression on me probably that Karl did, just because Karl was such a, I don't know, what do you want, like a physical, he was just, like I said, when he dunked it, he stood out.
He stood, I mean,
And
6'8",
yeah, he's
6'9",
probably
something
six,
like
seven, or
that.
eight easily in high school. And the thing is, it just sounded like he was tearing the gym apart when he dunked. And I'm sure it did for Benny too. But I personally remember Karl more. But I know I was in the gym when Benny played, and I know I followed him when he got off to University of Houston. By the way, if you're into Wikipedia, and I know stuff in there can be wrong, but Wikipedia says Benny Anders was being recruited by Dale Brown at Louisiana State, LSU. And Dale Brown said, "You got a T-shirt
Yes,
on." It was a T-shirt that said "Outlaw" on it. And Dale Brown said, "What does that mean?" He said, "Well, I'm known to not follow the rules, and that was the end of the recruiting trip right there. Dale Brown did not want anything to do with that. And so Benny, to as good as he was on the court, he never was a starter. Actually, he was what they called a dynamic role player. They meant for him to come off the bench and spark them, because they did have a guy named Clyde Drexler ahead of him. If they, I don't even know if they really played the same position, but guard wise, they had a dynamic one named Clyde Drexler too. But Benny definitely got in trouble while he was at Houston. So, he was known for his kind of flamboyance, which was kind of a thing back then. That's just before the Brian Bosworth days, actually, and the Deion Sanders days. I mean, he's right there, right on the cusp of when the players started realizing that maybe their personalities could get them paid too. And so Benny was known as the outlaw, and he lived up to it some at Houston, and we'll talk about that later. But anyway, so 1981ish, they're on this collision course, and I'm gonna assume, and I don't even know, did they play in the same district, or do you know?
I believe they did, because to play the 5 or 6 times, yeah, you'd see them in a tournament or two together. You'd probably run into them in state. But I would think, being as close proximity as they were, that a couple of those other matchups were
And
district
and
matchups
even
or
if
conference
and even
matchups.
with that, the thing is that like Wayne said, if you square off against each other more than 2 or 3 times, you get to know each other pretty well. And I'm gonna assume that the smart ladies and men who worked on these tournaments at our high school figured out that they better put these two teams on opposite sides of the bracket no matter what. I don't know how they
Bingo.
did the seedings or whatever, but if I'm running this tournament, they're going to be seeded 1 and 2 on opposite ends of the bracket from each other, because I am not having these guys play before the finals. No way. And so, Wayne, can you speak any about how, kind of the sort of the circus around that? Because if anybody had hype, it's Summerfield and Bernice back then.
Absolutely. As far as how they seeded, I believe, of course, they looked at record and they
Yeah,
did percentage. Like you got a 17-5 record, winning percentage of kind of I
yeah,
guess you
yeah,
could call it
sure.
power ranking type thing, if you will. So that's kind of how it was determined. But I also been told over the years, when we get to talk about dual state, with people that were involved as far as the running of it and scheduling and everything. Uh, well, think about this, Sean. Palestine Wheatley had a really good girls team mid 2000s, and they got them to dual state. Well, they wanted them down here because they knew they'd be a draw. Everybody was looking at them, and you had quality. And let me again reiterate: we're talking about mainly the boys' side of the bracket here. The girls'
Yes.
basketball was top notch. Tammy Pickering and Lynn Vance
Rose
from Parks
Avery. Yep.
Chapel, Rose Avery from Union, the Huddick girls teams, the Huddick girls teams of the mid to late '80s. The strong girls teams in the early
Yep.
2000s. So you had them down here to play in the tournament. Well, it was a big draw and they seeded them high. The same thing took place with Summerfield and Bernice. They're not going to play in the second round tournament. If they're going to see each other at all early,
At
it'll
the
be
worst.
semifinals
Yeah.
at the worst. And so I believe that year it was set up. I know Summerfield won it at 80 and 81. So it was set up for them to meet again, let's just say, and I hope I don't get in trouble with the NCAA, in the
Right.
Final Four. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, you'd have to put them against each other as late in the week as possible, because you made all your money on Saturday. So you
Right.
could probably get by with it on Saturday afternoon, but you really want them in there Saturday night. So, Wayne, you were a student, and did you have, I think you and I have talked about, did you work the tournament in any way, helping out with any of the organizations? So what'd you do, man?
We did. I know I didn't graduate at the top of my class. I'll admit that. But I wasn't a complete idiot. I was smart enough to get the best job you could get, and that was parking. Everybody parked. Think about the parking. Go back to that gym. Now, our gym, you had a driveway up to it, so to speak. But if you're facing the front of the gym, to the left was the football field. So they had a group out there handling parking. We handled parking in the front. Well, which one filled up first? The front would fill up. So as soon as it filled up, we'd go in and out the side door, catch some of the action, go back, watch the cars, catch some of the action. Well, I went ahead and volunteered. I'll do all that. Y'all go watch for a while because I
Yep.
wanted to see Benny and Karl. So I would get through with that, ease in there, watch the tournament. Now, this was the same tournament that I met probably the prettiest woman I've ever seen in all my life and ended up marrying.
Ah,
So that's my favorite dual state memory right there, and especially
wow.
from that '81 tournament. But Sean, I wanted to say this: we're talking about Karl and Benny, and we should. Karl Malone, one of the 50 greatest players in NBA history. Benny Anders, one of the most talked about players right now. You know, when you really get to talking to the old school guys, because of that documentary, Phi Slamma Jamma. And then again, they're mentioned in Surviving Advance. So really, you can tie them into two ESPN 30 for 30s, you know, one of the most popular things
Absolutely.
ESPN's ever done. But by the same token, let me throw this at you. Waldo, McNeil, Stevens, Emerson, Walker, which is over near Magnolia.
Yeah,
Then you
those are
go
Arkansas. I
Louisiana.
want to
Those
make
are
that
Arkansas
clear.
teams, folks. Go Louisiana, and I mentioned them before: Spearsville, Dubach, Sarepta,
Campty. Yep.
Campty. They all had
Yep.
really good teams, solid teams. Every one of these schools I just mentioned had solid programs. In the case of McNeil and Waldo, both were solid on the
Yep.
girls' side and boys' side. These teams, if you didn't have Karl Malone and Benny Anders there, could have easily, especially McNeil, there was like a 9 or 10 year run. They were either in the semis or in the finals. And I can't remember if it's boy. I know
Just
the
dominating, man. Dominating. Yeah.
yes, yeah. We're sitting here talking about these guys, and we should because they
They're
are
significant to the history of the
legends.
game of basketball. Seriously, that's not an
Yeah, not
overstatement at
just dual
all.
state tournament. Yeah, yeah, and you know when you got up there to go, well, hey man, McNeil's fixing to play Stevens. Oh, we got to see this. We
Yeah.
got to see the Road Runners, and these are teams that they're known for their basketball. It goes back to what you said a while ago, Sean. When they got to the summertime, they're getting ready for basketball. School starts their
They're
practices
rolling.
by mid-October.
They're rolling.
Their season starts. So when you look up in March, these teams are usually close to the state semifinals or in the finals, and they don't play
Yeah, I was
40
going to say a
games.
lot of Arkansas schools that have football, they'd be
Yeah,
lucky to play 25 games. These Louisiana and smaller Arkansas schools that didn't have football, they play 40 games a season. So, they play 2 or 3
yeah.
tournaments, and I don't know what the rules were on scheduling. I know they tightened them up over the years in the 80s, but, they played as much as they could, basically. Go ahead.
And a couple more teams. I just thought of
Yeah.
Downsville was in it some, and they might not have been consistent every year, but I remember them being good enough a couple times. They were in the final. If you got to the final four of dual state, you done something. And I remember Downsville being there, and I remember them hitting a game-winning shot in the consolation game against Parks Chapel. I mentioned the Trojans; they may have been our arch rivals, so to speak, in a number of sports, but they
Yep.
had quality teams, boys and girls, and they would always make a good run. Norfolk did good at times. In fact, won it in the '90s one time with Tony Lockhart when everybody thought, well, Junction's got it this year. They come in and upset
Well,
Junction and won the tournament, won it in the final. Yes, Junction.
big as a deal as it was a huge deal for us to win with the boys or girls team. And the boys won 3 years in a row. My freshman, sophomore, and junior years, the boys program won dual state, and then my brother won it later in the 90s. So I mean, three in a row is a big deal.
Yeah.
This was after Karl Malone was long gone and Benny Anders, thank goodness. But yeah, to your point, there were some really quality teams that had to duke it out. Those Union teams with Rose Avery, my God,
Oh my good. Sean
yeah, just
Rose Avery and Union.
one of the best coaches to ever
I
walk the hardwoods in Arkansas was Coach
thank you.
Gary Smith.
Yes.
Is that right?
Coach
Yeah, one of the best coaches
Gary
ever in
Don
the state of
Smith.
Arkansas, and Rose Avery, obviously one of the best women's players ever in the state of Arkansas. Just dominant, man. And so Yeah, unusual to have the win, and basically they'd alternate. I think they'd play a boys game, girls game, boys game, all through the day like that. And
Yeah.
so, if you're a basketball junkie, you just could not beat it, man. It was better. It was better basketball than the state tournament or the regionals or the district a lot of times. Because you,
Well, here's why. Go back to what you said. How far off are these
yeah,
schools? About an hour
yeah,
and a half at the most from the vast majority of them, vast majority. Your regional sometimes going to be a little ways off. State's usually going to be a good ways off. Every one of these teams we just mentioned, and let me say this before I forget. You're talking about Rose, Avery, and Union. Throw Huddig in there because they was having a
absolutely,
showdown with them during this time. And I'm sitting here trying my best to remember the Huddig girls' coach name, and I apologize. She had some
yeah.
quality teams, and it was a
Well,
battle every time those two got on the court. Now, every one of these schools we just mentioned, especially Stevens, McNeil, Waldo, Huddick, and Union on Arkansas side, and then Louisiana, Bernice, Summerfield.
the
Mount
Mullins
Holly,
brothers played
yes,
at Mount
Mount
Holly
Holly.
on those good teams, and their coach was phenomenal. Mount Holly's coach, I think, what was his
Uh,
Kathy, coach
Linwood,
boys and girls.
Kathy, yep,
Fantastic teams on
boys
both
and
sides.
girls. Every one of these schools brought a passionate fan base to the games. You go, well, they're small schools. Yeah, they may bring 75, 80 people, but they
Yeah,
congregated right around that team,
yeah,
and you heard them. Most of them were going to pack out a fourth of that gym. The gym was divided, kind of, so to speak, in four sections. So if you walk in the front to the right, one team would sit as you got up. You walked up to the court, and then right down beside them, there was a gap. Right down beside them was the other team. So they would congregate around their team, and you knew they were congregating around the team because you could
yes.
hear them and see them.
Hey, folks, it's Sean. I'm going to jump in here again and end this episode, part one of the dual state discussion at this point, and we'll pick this back up again in a couple of weeks with dual state part two. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you for joining us on GenX Classic Sports, where nostalgia meets the thrill of the game. Tune in next time for more insightful discussions and memorable moments, brought to you by Pine Street Productions. Until then, stay passionate about sports and keep the memories alive.